Caleb, what did you do last session to fix the Zoom? People were very thankful to you. Did you? Oh, great. Thank you. That's why I noticed sound came on like 10 minutes into it. So thank you. I finally was able to get they make a second recording, so I replaced the first one with the second one. Thank you. Okay, while we're waiting to get started, reminder if you need one that your case is due before class on Wednesday. The reason it's before class is we will be talking about the case for the first half of the next class. Where we'll go through the questions and not give you the right answer to the case because clearly there are variations you can adopt that'll get you to an answer, but talk about the big questions that hopefully you dealt with in the case as you went through. So before 10:30, group submission PDF file would appreciate because it's easier for me to put the comments right into the file. If you get it done early, don't wait till Wednesday, right? Get it in by tomorrow evening to get it out of the way so you can move on to the rest of your life. And I will, on the cover page, as I said, summarize the numbers, your NPV finite life, NPV longer life, cost of capital, because I will pull those numbers together for the class so you can see the variations across the class. So today we're going to actually almost mop up investment analysis. Let's see where we are. We've looked at how to decide on a project, right? But almost every project we've looked at so far has been a standalone project. What does that mean? You either take the project or you don't. So when you have standalone projects, you do exactly what we did. Estimate the cash flows, incremental cash flows. And if you're doing present value, you take the present value of those cash flows at a discount rate that reflects the risk of the project. Hopefully, I've repeated that enough that it's become imprinted. It's not the risk of the company, but the risk of the project. You get a present value, you can do an NPV, you can do an IRR. If the NPV is greater than 0, you accept the project. If the IRR is greater than your hurdle rate, you accept the project. But today I want to talk about the fact that sometimes projects are not standalone decisions. What does that mean? By taking a project, you might have to reject another project. Okay? So these are called mutually exclusive investments. Take a very simple example. My daughter is redoing her kitchen. And you have to pick a countertop, right? You can pick an expensive marble countertop that'll last 20 years, a less expensive countertop that might last 10 years. Those are mutually exclusive. If you pick one, you can't pick the other. We're going to talk about how do you pick between mutually exclusive investments. So in the real world, that's going to become an issue either because you can pick only one or because you have limited capital. And we'll talk about what limited capital does for you. So let's start with mutually exclusive investments. And as I said, those mutually exclusive investments can emerge from the type of project you're looking at, which is you can have only one countertop at a time, one flooring at a time, one roof at a time. You got to pick the best one. Or because you have limited capital and you can't pick every project that comes along that has a positive net present value. I want to keep the two in play, but we might deal with those separately because the latter comes from limited capital, and limited capital is fixable, right? It's fixable if somebody gives you the capital. So it might be a question we got to come up with a different kind of answer. So when you look at projects that are mutually exclusive, here are the three ways you can go. You can take the approaches we already have. You can compute the return on capital for each project and pick the one with the higher return on capital with all its limitations. You can do the NPV of both projects and pick the one with the higher NPV. And you can also compute the IRR of each project and pick the project with a higher IRR. Many private equity investors, when they pick investments, base it entirely on IRR. We'll talk about why they might go with IRR as opposed to NPV. But we want to talk about why these three approaches can give you different rankings or different choices. So when you're picking between project A and B, why might NPV lead you to pick project A and IRR lead you to pick project B? or vice versa, because that's going to come into play if you're picking projects or ranking them based on these approaches. So I'm going to take you through an exercise where I'm going to give you some very simple projects. And along the way, we're going to talk about what it is that might lead NPV and IRR to different choices. So let's say you're a company, you have to pick between two projects. Very different cash flow characteristics. On project A, you have an upfront investment of $1 billion. You make 800 million in year one, $1 billion in year two, 1.3 billion in year three. And then you have a big negative cash flow in year four. You say, what kind of project would I have a big, let's say it's a licensing project. We've got to pay some upfront and some at the end. The second project is a more conventional project. You have a big initial investment, which is negative, and then your cash flows turn positive. I'm just going to compute the NPV and IRR for both these projects, and let's see what comes out. Let's start with the IRR. What I've done here is actually computed the internal rate of return for this project, or the NPV for this project at different discount, for the two projects at different discount rates. So on project B, you can see the conventional drop-off. As my discount rate goes up, my net present value decreases. And the IRR is around 11%, 11.5%. On project A, you have a strange phenomenon occurring. Initially, as you increase your discount rate, your net present value actually goes up. Why? Because remember, you have that big negative cash flow at the end. It's coming in and tilting. There's a point, though, where it peaks and it starts going in the other direction. Already you can see the practical problem you're going to run into here, right? If you use IRR, project B has one IRR, but project A has more than one internal rate of return. I want you to think back to those projects and think about what it is about project A that gave you two internal rates of return. Anoki, you want to try it? What is it about project A that's giving it two internal rates of return? Go back and look at the cash flows because I think it might give you an idea. I'm sorry, what? It's got to do something with the cash flows, right? So what happens in year one? Your cash flow goes from negative to positive. Then what happens in year four? It goes from positive to negative. We don't think about it this way, but IRRs are roots to mathematical equations. Thank God we don't actually solve them as mathematical equations. Every time there's a sign change, there will be another internal rate of return. So if you have a project with 5 sign changes, you could potentially have 5 different internal rates of return. Saying, what kind of project? Could I have 5 sign changes? Let's say it's a 30-year project where every 5 years you got to come in and update your machinery. So you're going to get negative in year 5, negative in year 10. You can have 5 different internal rates of return. And what's the rule with IRR? If it's greater than your cost of capital, you accept it. If it's less than your cost of capital, you reject it. Let's assume your cost of capital falls right in the middle. Project A here has a 6.6% IRR or a 36.55% IRR. Right? Project B has only one IRR, 8.65%. Let's say your cost of capital is 8%. You can already see the challenge you're going to face, right? One IRR is higher than your cost of capital, the other is lower. There are entire books that people write about what to do with multiple IRRs. If I wrote that book, it'll have only one sentence. If you have multiple IRRs, just go with the net present value. Why? There can only be one NPV, no matter how many cash flow changes there are. So if you have multiple internal rates of return, they become almost unusable. I mean, I can give you tricks you can play, but this actually shows up in investing when people compute the IRR of a client's investments, because they bring money in and they take money out. You can have a dozen different sign changes over a 10-year period. And if you ask me to compute the IRR, I'm essentially going to give up very quickly. But I can always compute an NPV. So if you have multiple IRRs, now you can see why it happens, because you have the cash flow changes. Just skip IRR and go directly to NPV. Any questions on multiple internal rates of return and why they happen? Let's take a second project. And here, I think you very quickly see why I get different answers. I have 2 projects. The first project requires an initial investment of $1 million and has cash flows of $350,000, $450,000, $600,000, and $750,000. The second project has an initial investment of 10 million and cash flows that are much bigger. I compute the NPVs for both projects. The NPV for project 2 is almost 1.36 million. The NPV for project 1 is 467,000. So if I pick based on an NPV, project 2 is better than project 1. But if I base it on IRR, I get a 33.66% internal rate of return for project 1 and a 21% internal rate of return for project 2. Now, clearly, I'm getting different choices. But there's a very simple reason I'm getting different choices, right? Derek, what is it about project 1 that's giving me the low NPV and the higher IRR? It's, but more importantly, it's a smaller project, right? Think about it. Percentage rates of return are always going to tilt you more towards smaller projects. It's easier to make a 50% return when you're investing $10 than when you're investing 10 million. So already you can see larger projects will have higher NPVs because the dollar values are going to be higher. Smaller projects are going to have higher internal rates of return. If you open up most corporate finance textbooks, they're pretty categorical about which one you should pick. Which one should you pick in traditional corporate finance? A higher NPV project, a higher IRR. Do you remember what we said about taking a project? What does it do when you take a positive net present value project? Your value increases by the net present value, right? If I take that to the next step, then I should be taking project 2 over project 1 because I will get a bigger increase in value. So here's what I want to do. This half of the class is going to take project 2. So you're going to go with the higher NPV because that's what the corporate finance textbooks. This half of the class is going to take project 1 because the highest IRR. I want you to think about at the end of the year what your biggest concern will be with what your choice led you to. So you took project 2, right? You took $10 million. You took the project because it's higher. But let's say your total capital budgeting project is only budget is only 20 million. That's all you can spend. You've taken half of it and taken this one project on January 5th of 2025. What's your biggest worry? You've used up half your total capital budgeting allocation. What if another great project comes along that'll give you what, 12 million in initial investment, you can't take it anymore? So your biggest concern if you take the big net present value project is other projects coming down you might not take. Why? Because you don't have enough capital. Conversely, if I look at you and you say, you picked the higher IRR project, what's your biggest worry? Wade, what's your biggest worry going to be?
My biggest worry would be, can we find enough projects?
Exactly. If this is the only project you get all year, and there's no guarantee there will, you got stuck with 19 million sitting in cash you couldn't invest. You can see your concerns are different. When you take based on IRR, you're worried about, hey, what if other projects don't come along? If you base it on NPV, your worry is, what if other projects come along? And if you think through it, each of these is going to lead you to a different outcome. Why did you have a constraint of 20 million on your capital budget? Because you didn't have access to capital, right? If you're a company which has limited access to capital, you're a small company, you're a private company, you're in a market where external capital access is limited. Do you see where you're going to go? You're going to go with internal rate of return because you're worried about the limits. In contrast, if you're Apple, this should never be a reason, right? You can't complain to me you don't have enough cash. You have 200 billion sitting around. If you're Apple, you should always go with NPV because you don't have capital constraints. Whether you go with NPV or IRR is not as black and white as textbooks make it out to be. Technically, I think NPV is a sounder measure of returns, and we'll talk about why. But I can fully understand if you're a company with limited capital access that you go with the internal rate of return because you want to get the most bang for your buck. Any questions? Okay. So IRR might be a less, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Whoa, wait. NPV doesn't account for riskiness? Yeah. 50% of the time. No, but wait, what did you discount these cash flows at? It's a risk-adjusted discount rate, right? So if the your cash flow in year 5 was guaranteed, what discount rate would you have used? The risk-free rate, right? So when you do NPV, it is the risk is in your discount rate. And NPV is a risk-adjusted number. With IRR, you're technically right. The IRR doesn't capture the risk, but what do I compare the IRR to? A cost of capital, a risk-adjusted rate. So both NPV and IRR do incorporate risk. They incorporate a very special kind of risk, the risk you cannot diversify away as an investor. But they're both risk-adjusted numbers. Okay? But is everybody clear on this choice between NPV and IRR? It depends very much on whether you feel you have a capital rationing constraint. So let's step back. Let's think about where capital rationing constraints come from. Almost every company you talk to will claim that they have limited capital. Some of it comes from the outside, right? You might not be able to access capital. Why? Because your markets are ill-formed, because banks won't lend you money, because equity markets are difficult to access, because you're a private business. In a private business, where does equity have to come from? You. You say, I have only so much money. So sometimes capital rationing constraints come from outside. But if you're a publicly traded company, sometimes capital rationing constraints come from within. I'll give you an example. There are companies that will refuse to issue new shares. Not because they cannot, but if they did, what's going to happen? What's a bogeyman that every analyst brings out of the closet when you issue shares? Dilution, right? So basically, they're afraid of dilution. They will not issue shares. It's an internal constraint. They choose not to borrow money, not because debt is going to somehow put them into distress, but they don't like to borrow money. Capital rationing constraints can sometimes come from outside. They can come from, is there a difference though from where they come in? Let's suppose you take IRR because you have a capital rationing constraint, but it's entirely internally imposed because of what you did. You've chosen not to raise equity. And you're turning away projects as a consequence, right? Because of this capital rationing constraint. I will ask you to take a look at your constraint. You're so set against dilution, but look at how many projects you had to reject last year because you didn't want to issue shares. They might still choose not to issue the shares, but anytime you impose a constraint as a business, you got to ask yourself what the cost of that constraint is. And if you're a company where you're giving up so much with that constraint, it might be worth re-examining that constraint if it's an internal constraint. But if you're an Argentine company, this has nothing to do with you, right? It's the fact that the market is not allowing you to raise capital, therefore using IRR. There, I completely understand the focus on percentage rates of return. Questions? Now, one way in which you can stay with NPV and bring in the capital rationing issue, the problem with an NPV is it's a dollar value or an absolute value. If I can somehow scale it to how much you invested in a project, I would get almost a percentage value, a scaled NPV. It's not high tech. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take each NPV and divide it by the initial investment of the project. What does it do? It tells me how many dollars of net present value I get per dollar of investment. It's like a percentage return. I stay with NPV, and I still factor in a capital rationing constraint. So if you have a capital rationing constraint, you just don't like to use internal rate of return for whatever reason, and you want to stay with NPV, I can give you a way of bringing in that capital rationing constraint by saying it's called go with the higher profitability index, an NPV that's scaled to your initial investment. So you talked about multiple internal rates of return. Why do they come? Because cash flows change signs. What to do if you have them? Just don't use IRR. We talked about NPV and IRR giving you different answers when your projects have different scale. Larger projects will tend to have higher net present values. Smaller projects will tend to have higher percentage rates of return, just a scaling effect. Which one should you adopt? I'm going to ask you, do you have a capital rationing constraint? In fact, the company you have in your project. I mean, right now, you might not be able to change the way they do. I'd like you to think about, should your company use NPV or IRR? So what are some of the things you're going to look at to make that judgment? You might look at the size of the company, smaller companies. What else? Is there something on the balance sheet you could look at that you can confront them with when they say we have a capital rationing constraint? Kelly, what might you look at the balance sheet to see if you have a capital rationing constraint? That might actually feed into their constraint, right? Because if you borrowed money, I can understand you don't want to take projects. But on the other side of the balance, when I look at their assets, there's something that will give away the fact that they're lying when they say they have a. So if Apple says they have a capital rationing constraint, they have the cash balance, right? If you look at a company that has 40 billion in cash, stop talking about capital rationing constraints. If you want to use IRR and you want because you like it, go ahead and do it. But don't use IRR now because you have, sometimes companies as they grow hold on to what they used to do when they were much smaller. Many of these companies at some point in time are high growth companies with lots of projects, not enough capital. Of course, they had a capital rationing constraint. What's happened to them over time? They've now become much larger. They've accumulated large cash balances. The projects have dropped off. There's a tipping point. Remember that corporate life cycle that I showed you? Early in the life cycle, IRR makes more sense to you, but there will be a tipping point as your growth starts to level off where you got to stop and say, it doesn't make sense for us to talk on percentage returns anymore. 12% return might not have looked good enough for us 10 years ago when we were a young company with lots of projects, but today, 10% is about as good as it gets. It's higher than our cost of capital. I think one reason tech companies end up with big cash balances is they get spoiled. They get spoiled because in their growth days, in their glory days, they make 30, 40, 50% returns. Then what happens? You're saying, well, if I don't make 30% returns, I'm not going to take projects. No wonder you have a $40 billion cash balance then. So when you look at cash balances, that might be a sign that you're aging out of whatever hurdle rate you've been using artificially to turn projects away. One final example on NPV versus IRR. Here I have two projects, both require $10 million initial investment. Different patterns on cash flows. The first project has high cash flows upfront, lower later. The second project has low cash flows upfront and higher later. There's a timing difference, right? But remember, both NPV and IRR are time-weighted measures of return. They're factoring in when your cash flows come in. But here's the puzzle. If you look at the NPVs, the NPV of project 2 is higher than the NPV of project 1. But in terms of IRR, the reverse happens. See if you can figure out why that is. They're both time-weighted measures of return. Why is the internal rate of return giving you a different answer than the NPV? Tanmay, you want to try? What is it about them? Yeah. But I thought time weighting should take care of that, right? So there must be some difference in how they're time weighting the cash flows. Because if I were computing return on capital to NPV, this would be it, right? The time. But here they're both time weighting cash flows, but they seem to be time weighting it differently because they're arriving at different conclusions. Right? So tell me what it is about getting the cash flows earlier that gives you a different answer. What's the same so what's the discount rate I use for NPV? Capital. What's the discount rate I use for IRR? It's whatever discount rate that makes my NPV 0, right? When I get cash flows in year 1, this $5 million, what happens to it? It gets invested somewhere else, right? When I use NPV, I implicitly assume, because we're never explicit about it, that it gets reinvested at what rate? The cost of capital. In other words, the money I make in intermediate periods makes me 0 net present value. Essentially, it earns a fair rate of return. I can even leave it in cash or T-bills and earn a T-bill rate. When I do NPV, I implicitly assume that the cash flows I get in year 1 and year 2 essentially earn my cost of capital. In other words, they're not creating excess value. But when I use IRR, you know what I implicitly assume? What do I invest the year 1 cash flows at in project A? At 21.41%. You see why this is inherently a more dangerous assumption? If I have a great project, and it's a one-time great project, and I get cash flows in year 1, I magically create another great project which earns the same rate of return. Now do you see why PE investors love to use internal rate of return? Even if their cash flows are right, which is a big if, and they tell you the IRR for this project is, and let's say it's a 20-year project, is 30%. You know why it's a lie? Because the cash flows you get in year one, year two, you somehow have to find other investments to make at 30% to earn that 30% rate of return. NPV assumes you reinvest your cash flows at the hurdle rate, which is a risk adjusted rate. And by definition, a rate you can earn in the market right now. You can put your money in a mutual fund and earn that rate of return. But IRR assumes you reinvest the IRR, which means the higher the internal rate of return for an investment becomes, the more suspicious you should become about that number, especially if it's a long term investment, because you're making this internal assumption about what you can invest that money at. So those of you going to private equity and hedge funds, watch out for IRRs because they'll come at you fast and furious. And I mean, one way you can get the conversation back on steady ground is to say, hey, that 65% IRR you're giving me on this 20% project, can you please tell me what other projects you're going to give me in year one and year two, which will also earn 65%? So differences in assumptions about reinvestment are inherent. And because it's implicit, you don't even think about it. They're both time weighted. And which one you use then will depend on whether you have this infinite stream of great projects, in which case, go with the IRR. I don't have a problem with it. Or if this is more likely to be a one and done, in which case you have to be very careful about assuming that reinvestment. So this NPV versus IRR reinvestment rate assumption is why corporate finance textbooks tell you should always use the NPV. It's a little bit of an overreaction, because is there a way I could fix the IRR to make it reinvest money at the cost of capital? Any ideas? What's the problem here? I'm taking my cash flow in year one and assuming I can make 21.41%, right? What's my cost of capital? Let's say it's 12% or 15%. What if I reinvest the cash flow I get in year one at the cost of capital, actually explicitly? That's basically what's called a modified internal rate of return. It's not rocket science. You're essentially taking the IRR, and instead of assuming you can earn the IRR in every single cash flow, you're assuming you can earn the hurdle rate. I'll show you the mechanics of how this will play out. You have a project, initial investment is 1,000, 300, 400, 500, and 600. You take the cash flow in year one. Instead of assuming you reinvest at the IRR, you reinvest at the cost of capital. Let's say the cost of capital is 15%. And you keep track of how much money you will have at the end of year four. Take the cash flow in year two, invest it at 15% for 2 years. Take the cash flow in year three, invest it at 15% for 1 year. At the end of the fourth year, add up all your money. So think like an investor whose money is going into this end bank account. The end, you're going to have 2,160 in the bank. Your initial investment is 1,000. You know you're going to have 2,160. Back out a rate of return. The modified IRR here will be lower than your IRR because you're effectively earning only 15% of that money. So you can fix NPV for the scaling problem by doing that profitability index. You can fix IRR for the reinvestment problem by doing a modified IRR. When it comes to NPV versus IRR, I'm not going to be a purist. Because when you use IRR, you're 90% of the way towards me, right? It's a time. I'd much rather use IRR than return on capital or payback. You move 90% of the way towards me. Why would I push you away by saying, you're not perfect, you're not using NPV? I'll take what you're comfortable. Maybe you prefer percentage rates of return, which I completely understand. And I'll try to fix at the margin whatever might get you into trouble. In this case, the reinvestment assumption. So that 60% return project, the private equity, in fact, take that 60%, recompute it using an 8 or 9% cost of equity, which is what you're earning right now. It's amazing how quickly the 60% will start to drop off to 25, 26, 27% with that internal rate of return being replaced by the hurdle rate. So any questions on the mechanics of NPV versus IRR? Because I'm going to kind of put it to sleep because there's some corporate finance class where you spend 2, 3, 4 sessions talking about NPV versus IRR. I think you kind of lose the script when you get there. They're both time weighted, but it's good to know what causes them to give you different rankings and which ones you use. Yes?
So obviously this is forward looking and trying to pick projects for the future, but what if you were trying to measure backward looking? Most people use IRR to look at past performance.
No, most people use IRR to measure past performance, but what's the end game there? After you do that, you can't obviously go back and fix your past mistakes. What comes out of that analysis? You fire your portfolio manager, you replace him. So we'll talk about postmortems because both NPV and IRR, when you look backwards, you're asking a very different question than when you're looking forward. Remember the sunk costs? When you're looking forward, sunk costs should always be ignored. When you're looking backwards, I care about sunk costs. So we'll talk about what's different about looking back because there you're doing it for a different reason. You're trying to assess, was this manager good for me? Did they pick good projects? And that's a good question to ask and answer. But I think, when you look at projects, the forward-looking decision, you're looking at incremental future cash flows. The mechanics won't change when you look backwards, but the end game is different, right? So let's summarize why NPV and IRR give you different answers. First, for any project with any set of cash flows, there will always be a unique NPV. There's only one NPV. So if you show me two NPVs for your Celsius each project, you've just broken open finance as we know it. And I'm very interested in how you got there. But you can have multiple IRRs. I don't know whether you've examined your Celsius each cash flows. I don't know whether there might be a negative cash flow in the future and what might cause it. If it does happen, you know exactly what's going to, the deceptive thing is if you use the IRR function in Excel, it actually comes back with one number, even if there's more than one IRR. You know how it comes back with one number? It makes you guess a number, and then it gives you the number. It's very deceptive. I'd much rather that Excel came back and said, I can't give you a number. There are two internal rates of return. But because it's Excel, it wants to act like it knows more than it does. So don't trust the Excel IRR. That's why I said do the NPV profile if you're interested, because there you will always see the multiple internal rates of return because you'll cross the line once, twice, three times, as many IRRs as there are. Second, NPV is a measure of dollar surplus or euro surplus. It's an absolute number. IRR is a percentage return. So almost by definition, bigger projects are more likely to have larger NPVs. Smaller projects are more likely to have percentage rates of return. If you have capital rationing, you might go with a percentage rate of return, but do it for the right reasons. And third, the two make different assumptions about what rate you can reinvest the money at. NPV assumes you can earn your cost of capital, basically that you make zero net present value on your intermediate cash flows. If you go out and take positive net present, that's icing on the cake. You can do, but effectively doesn't put it into your existing project, and I think that's the right thing to do. IRR assumes you can earn your internal rate of return, and that can get you into trouble. So those are projects with the same lives. Let's say you're comparing projects with different lives, and here I'm going to use my daughter's kitchen to illustrate. Every decision she made, she had to face a choice. She's a school teacher. She's on a constrained budget. So every choice she had to think about. So the flooring, the guy came in and said, well, I can offer you three types of flooring. They have different costs. And if you look purely at cost, there was one choice, but it was usually a flooring that would last 7 years or 6 years. But if you chose a different kind of flooring, cost you more, it lasts 15 years. You're saying, so what? I've been training her on NPV. She's very resistant to this idea. But you could take the NPV of the cost of each one, right? The costs over 7 years. And if you look just at NPV, you're going to find that the project with the fewer years is going to have the lower net present value of cost. You have fewer years of spending money. When you're comparing projects with different lives, you're going to see this play out. So let's take a very simple example. Let's say you have two projects, one with a 5-year life and the second with a 10-year life. Let's assume they're mutually exclusive. So if you take one, you can't take the other. So you're trying to decide between a 5-year project and your 10-year project. I'm going to give you the cash flows. Initial investment of $1 billion, cash flows of $400 million every year. The NPV for project one is $442 million. On project B, I spent more upfront, $1.5 million, but I get $350 million cash flows for 10 years, NPV of $478 million. So based purely on NPV, project B is better than project A, right? IRR, you don't have an issue. So file that away. IRR will give you a percentage rate of return, but time doesn't matter. If I pick purely on NPV almost every single time, you're going to see what I'm going to tilt with, right? I'm going to go to the longer life project because you have more cash flows. Imagine being Scott Boras, right? Pete Alonso is your client. The Mets have been holding out. And they come to you and say, We can give you a 2-year contract or a 5-year contract. If you just look at the money you will make over the entire contract life, which one's going to give you more total money? The 5-year contract, you're getting paid for 5 years. So in baseball, what do people report in addition to the total contract? They report the payment you're going to get per year. It's a common sense answer, right? Take the annual amount because that's going to be comparable, but you can't compare the total values of two contracts if one is 3 years and one is 5 years. So I'm going to give you the two ways of dealing with this different life problem. In this one, there's an easy fix. It does require an implicit assumption. We'll see what that implicit assumption is. The first project is a life of 5 years. The second project is a life of 10 years, right? So what could I do on the first project to make it comparable to the second project? I can do it twice. There is an implicit assumption, So when you look at project life, you're already going to see NPVs higher. The implicit assumption is in year 5, I'm going to be able to replicate this project and do it a second time. If I just look at annual payments on contracts, you know what this lead agents to do, right? They'll always pick the shorter term contract because if you assume you can replicate the shorter term contract, what's the difference between signing it to? But what's the danger Scott Boras gets you into as a player when he signs a shorter term contract? At the end of 2 years, you go to sign, but your ERA is soared through the roof or your hitting average is dropped off, your second 2-year contract. This is the reason why Boras wants 10-year contracts. Lock a pitcher in for 10. Max Fried, I like the guy, but he's 29 years old. I know exactly what I'll be feeling in about 6 years looking at Max Fried. I'd have signed him for too much on a per year basis. But assuming you can keep replicating the projects, you'll always go with the shorter term because you'll get pretty much the same cash flows. And if you take the net present value of doing project A twice versus doing project B once, those NPVs are comparable. You think this is good, this is what I'm going to do on the quiz. Okay, let's say that you decide you're going to do this in the quiz. There's an easy way I can get you, if that's my end game. It's not my end game, but if I wanted to. I could give you a 7-year project and a 9-year project to compare. How would you make them comparable then? You'll have to take the 7-year project 9 times. This is a nice thing about working with prime numbers. And the 9-year project 7 times. You'll have a 63-year combined project. Can you imagine sitting there computing cash flows for the next 63 years on a 30-minute quiz? There must be an easier way, right? And there is. In fact, I gave you kind of that answer when I said you compare the annual amount. One easy way is to just take the NPV and divide by the life of the project. I could take the 478 and divide by 10. I could take the 442 and divide by 5. But what would I be missing if I just divided the NPV by the number of years? NPV is time weighted, right? Dividing by the number of years, you're not factoring in time. So I'm just going to add one layer. It's not even that sophisticated. I'm going to take the NPV and ask myself a question. What would I require on an annual basis to get the same NPV? If you take the 442 million, remember it's a 5-year project, $122 million every year for the next 5 years. The present value of that at the 12% cost of capital will give you the same NPV. So I've taken the first NPV and converted into what's called an equivalent annuity. Essentially, how much annual cash flow would I need to get that NPV? The second project, 478 million, is a 10-year project. With a 12% cost of capital, that annuity works out to 84.6 million. I'm going to go with a higher equivalent annuity because it gives me more. Implicitly, I'm making the same assumptions I do in replication. But I don't have to go through the process. On the 7 and the 9-year project, you can take the NPVs of the 2 projects, convert the first project into an annuity. So it's as simple as entering the PV and looking for your payment to give you the same present value. So think of it as a slightly more sophisticated version of just averaging over time because it factors in the time value. Like this is what I worked out. I told her to do it, but my daughter would not do it. So I took her, countertops and I worked out, this is how much you're paying up front. This is how much it costs you on an annual basis. Because she has a time value of money and she has to factor that into her decision making. So when you think about making choices, and we do this on a daily basis, should I go with the less expensive car or the more expensive car, assuming that they have different lifetimes? This can be a way in which you can break the tie by converting net present value, which is a lump sum, into an annual amount. Any questions on converting into annuities? Try this out though, on your calculator, computer, whatever you use for your annuities, because until you do it, the mechanics might mess you up. So make sure you can convert a present value to an annual amount. But at least the intuition is I can compare annual amounts, but I can't compare NPVs. Yes? Annuity. Oh, that's the annuity you're looking for. The payment, if that's the, I don't know what the calculated lingo would be, but in traditional calculators, this is usually the PMT button, the payment button. So basically, I'm entering the PV, the life, and the discount rate, looking for the payment. So that's effectively what I'm doing, and that converts a present value into a payment. Right? So we've talked about all these different ways to pick projects, right? We can look at return on investment, whether return equity or return invested capital. We can look at payback, very simple, very intuitive. How many years will it take for me to get, or discounted payback if you want to cover the amount with time value of money. You can look at NPV, and we talked about all the layers to NPV. It's a dollar value, that's kind of a prompt, but it's value added. It factors in this reasonable assumption about intermediate cash flows. You can look at IRR, percentage number that might be attractive, but it comes with this cost of reinvestment rate assumptions. Or you can use this PI, profitability index, or you can add modified internal rate of return to the mix. Let's say you're the CFO of a company. You're trying to decide which of these approaches you're going to adopt as your metric across the company. Don't tell me all of the above. Yeah, I know your attempt to say, why can't we do all of the 6? Because ultimately you will have to choose, right? So that's not a tiebreaker. You can do all of the calculations, but one of them has to rule. What are some of the things that'll go into you look at to make that judgment? First, will it matter whether you're a family-owned business and you're the owner, or a public company? Why might that be? What if why'd that make a difference? Because first, it's your wealth tied up. You got this total beta issue. You can't bring in more equity. You're limited capital. You're saying, I'm going to have to make the best percentage rate of return. If you're a public company, you have access to capital, at least if you choose to use it. So you might be more likely to go with NPV as a public company as opposed to private business. Does it matter where you're in the life cycle? As we talked about, young companies early in the life cycle, you should probably go for the most bang for your buck, percentage rates of return as you mature as a company. When can you use accounting returns? As you get more mature, the NPV rules and the accounting return on capital rules will tend to converge. So if you're a mature company and you insist on using accounting return on capital to pick projects, you'll probably pay a smaller price than a younger company. So when you work with a company and they use a decision rule that is different than what you would expect, ask some questions. Maybe there's a good reason they're using IRR or even accounting return. And you can suggest tweaks to it to bring in time value and things that they're not factoring in. But there's no one answer that's going to cut across every company and every business because it depends on your characteristics. Saying, will what's happening in the market affect me? I mean, I use the example of the last quarter of 2008. What happened in the last quarter of 2008? You have a market crisis. What does a market crisis do? It affects your access to capital, right? You can't go back. Venture capitalists have stopped giving you money. Even if you've been using NPV until now, you might say, now I have to shift to IRR because we live in a very different setting. So be flexible, be adaptable. Don't be dogmatic saying NPV or nothing, because you'll more likely than not get nothing. Okay. So these surveys that I've looked at what companies use, and the results are actually pretty interesting. So this is a comparison of 2001 to 2022, large versus small companies, right? So percentage of companies that use, and you can see that the numbers add up to well over 100%, which tells you what? A lot of companies do all of the above. So it doesn't quite tell you what dominates, but at least on a percentage basis, NPV and IRR at the top. I have a survey from 1976. And accounting return on capital was on top. So over the last 50 years, there's been a shift towards time value adjusted measures of return. I guess that's good news. Now, 50 years of corporate finance is sticking. But as you go down, you see scenario analysis. I'm not even sure what that means, I'll be quite honest. How is that a metric? I mean, you can take all of these approaches and do scenarios. You can do the NPV under 5 scenarios, which tells me that CFO says scenario analysis is mistaking what you do with the metric, with the metric itself. Surprisingly high percentage of firms still think about payback. It's the most primitive of approaches, right? And you know what? Post 1980s, the use of payback actually surged. It had dropped off. And one of the reasons was leverage buyouts and debt at a lot of companies. Do you see why having debt will make you much more interested in payback? You have a lot of debt. What's your first concern? Survival. You need to get the cash flows to pay off the debt. So when you have to pick between two projects, you're going to go with the project with the front-ended cash flows over the... So there is, again, a good reason why these approaches hang in there. Return on invested capital, book return, big, if you see the numbers, big difference, you know, between 2020, so you can look at 2022, and far fewer firms actually use return on invested capital. I'm sorry, far more firms use return on invested capital. And this is, I think, that when I told it became a magic bullet and people going around saying, no, return on invested capital rules. So you can go down the list and you can see profitability index, real options we'll come back and talk about because that's kind of this magical buzzword again that people have used to take projects. Okay? Simulation analysis, again, scenario analysis, simulation are not metrics. They're ways in which you can compute the metrics. And finally, adjusted present value, which I'll hold off till we get to capital structure because the way it's practiced is such a bastardized version of what it should be that at this point, I'm not even sure what it means. So adjusted present value is really a capital structure approach. It keeps debt separate. But clearly, they're all over the place. And many of these companies, you see 5 or 6 metrics reported for a project, which is, I think, a dangerous place to leave decision makers in because you know what's going to happen, right? Your biases are going to play out in how you pick projects. So any questions about the mechanics of all of the different metrics? Each comes with pluses and minuses. Factor them in picking. I also want now to talk about side costs and side benefits. When I talked about the Rio Disney theme park, I acted like it was a standalone project which got cash flows and essentially you looked at the theme park and just the theme park. But when Disney opens a theme park, it gets some side benefits, right? So when it opened to, Euro Disney in Paris, it actually saw a jump in people coming to Disney movies in Europe because you now had this new audience you were drawing on. It might increase your sale of merchandise because you have a theme park now. So there are side benefits you often get from taking an investment. Are there side costs sometimes from taking an investment as well? Yeah. Your side costs might include that you have to take resources you already own, people who work in Burbank, and send them to Paris because they have to run that theme park. It might be physical assets you own that you're transferring to this theme park. There are both side benefits and side costs. And what drives me crazy is when they're treated as garnishing. What does that mean? Let's say you're Disney or any movie company. You look at the movie numbers and you say, this movie standing alone has a negative net present value. So that's the end of the game, right? You don't take the movie. And then somebody pipes up saying, but there could be side benefits. Okay. We should take the project. Now I'm not okay. If you're going to talk side benefits, your job is to bring them into the analysis. If you're going to talk side costs, you have to use it explicitly. It's not going to be easy to do. Some of these side benefits and side costs are fairly difficult to get your hands on. But if you're going to make a decision based on them, it's your obligation to bring them into the numbers. So I'm going to start with this notion of what I call an opportunity cost. It's kind of a generic word anytime you use something that could be used elsewhere, right? But I'm going to use it in a very specific sense. When especially large companies take projects, they often take things they already own, resources, facilities, and they use it on the project. And because they already own it, you know what the easy way to deal with it is, right? We already own it. There is no cash flow, so we're going to ignore it. But that doesn't make any sense, right? When you use something on a project, there is always a cost, and your job is to assess what that cost is. You could sell that asset if that's feasible. When I walk through the Disney Burbank headquarters, all these buildings, many of them are only half full now. Right? More stuff is being done at home. So you're saying there's excess buildings, additional building there. Could you sell it? Probably not, because it's right in the middle of your headquarters. If you can't sell it, maybe you can rent or lease it out, let somebody else use it. Or you can ask yourself, if I use this building, what do I give up later? In other words, there's always a cost. And the question you got to ask is, what is that cost? How do I bring it into the decision? So let's take a very simple example of an opportunity cost. Let's assume that Disney owns land in Rio already. Don't ask me how they bought the land. They must have bought it for some other reason. It's been sitting out there. And if the Rio Disney, remember, you haven't made the decision on the Rio Disney theme park yet. If it gets taken, that land will be used to house the office buildings for the theme park. They already own the land. They don't have to pay for the land. But I'm going to add a couple of qualifiers here for you to make your decision. If they don't take the Rio Disney theme park, they have an opportunity. They might not use it to sell the land for $40 million. But it's land they bought a few years ago for $5 million. So the book value of the land is $5 million. They can sell it for $40 million. And I want you to return to the Rio Disney theme park assessment, right? So you're looking at the cash flows, and now I'm telling you they're going to use this land. And the question I have is specifically about the number to attach to this land I'm using. Should I ignore the cost because Disney already owns the land? Technically, they don't have a cash flow, right? But is there an opportunity cost? Yeah, you can sell the land. In which case, what do I show as my cost of the land? I could show the $5 million, which is the book value of the land. Is that going to fix the... Is that my opportunity cost? No, I'm not going to sell the land. I could sell it for $40 million. It looks like I'm getting close to the answer. But if I sell it for $40 million, I will have a loose end to tie up, right? I sold it for $40 million. I bought it for $5 million. There will be a $35 million gain on which I have to pay some kind of tax. Let's say a capital gains tax of 20%. When you want to think through these things, think them all the way through. In this case, you sell the land for $40 million. You're going to have a $35 million capital gain, 20% tax at $7 million. In my Rio Disney analysis, in my initial investment, I'm going to show a minus $33 million. You're saying, where is that minus 30? That is my opportunity cost of using land that I could have sold elsewhere and collected the $33 million. Now let's take a trickier exercise, right? Remember Bookscape, retail firm? Let's assume that they're getting outsold because a lot of people are buying their books online. So Bookscape decides it's going to create this online retail venture on the side, and it's asked you to assess whether it makes sense. So here's what they're going to do. If they start this venture, they're going to make revenues of $1.5 million in year 2, and that number is going to grow over time at 10%. The cost of the books you sell will be 60% of your revenues. So I'm kind of giving you what they will make on this online venture. Okay? The initial investment you will need will be to set up the computers, the online, so you're investing $1 million, you're going to make revenues of $1.5 million in year 2, and essentially the expected profits from that. You will have to pay some employees to directly run this online venture. Let's say the direct costs are going to be $150,000 in year 1 and grow 10% a year. So I've given you the revenues, the cost of the books, the salaries, and there will be a working capital requirement specific to this online venture. Maybe everybody orders Harry Potter books, and that's all they order. You need hundreds and hundreds of copies. That working capital is going to be 10% of revenues with the investments made at the beginning of each year. So I'm sticking to the script on items like working capital by telling you when you have to make the investment. And the tax rate in your income is 40%. Let's work out what the cash flows will be on this online venture. Before I do that, though, let me get the cost of capital nailed down. You're saying, but we already have a cost of capital Bookscape. We have a cost of capital Bookscape for its traditional physical bookstore. But this is going to be an online venture. Let's say, at least at the time that I was looking at this, online retail was riskier than brick and mortar retail. But that you're going to keep the same debt ratio you did for the rest of your business. The unlevered beta, remember I looked at total beta because you're essentially looking at the total risk here, is 3.02. You're getting a much higher cost of equity because you got a higher unlevered beta, therefore a higher levered beta. The cost of equity is going to be 21.5%. Much higher discount rate, but again, we're following exactly the script we've done in every project, right? We estimate the cash flows, we come up with a discount rate for the project based on what risk there is in the project. My cost of capital is 18%, much, much higher than the 12% plus or the 10.3% early that I got as a cost of cap for Bookscape as a company. Riskier project, higher cost of capital. I'm almost set to look at the NPV for the project. Here are my cash flows, and I know a lot of numbers on the page. My revenues build up 1.5 million to 2.2 million over the next 4 years. I'm going to assume that at the end of 4 years, you're going to wrap up the project and get salvage value. I'll ask you in a couple of minutes what I would have done differently if I assumed this project would continue forever. I estimate the expenses, labor, materials, depreciation. I come up with an operating income. I'm starting to make money right from the beginning, but it's building up over time. I can make more money. I get after-tax operating income, and then I go through the process of converting to cash flows. By now, the process should be a pretty familiar one. You add depreciation. Why? Because it's a non-cash expense. You subtract out change in working capital. Why? Because, it affects your cash flows. I'm taking accrual earnings and making the cash flows. And because I'm wrapping up the project at the end, I look at my salvage value. The salvage value here is entirely the working capital being returned. There's no physical asset salvage value because the $1 million I invested up front was in computers, and by the time I get to year 4, I'm good. But essentially, I'm running the project into the ground. I'm getting my earnings and cash flows. Let me pause right there and ask a question. If I had decided to assess this project as an ongoing project, what are some of the changes you'd expect to see in my numbers? First, at the end of year 4, instead of a salvage value, what should I have? A terminal value that reflects. But for the first 4 years, given that I want this project to go on forever, what else should you expect to see? Should expect to see reinvestment of some of that money back because I can't run things into the ground. So what you're probably going to see is a capital expenditure that shows up every year because I want to keep this project going. My cash flows will reflect my choice on how I decide to run the project. Here it's a finite life project. I run it into the ground. I compute the net present value. The net present value I get at that 18.12% is 76,375. That's good, right? Greater than 0. But there are 2 things I forgot to tell you about this project. The first is the general manager for the store is being asked to look after this project as well. And she comes back and says, look, this is a lot of work. You need to pay him a lot more to do it. So let's assume that because of this project, you're going to have to increase her salary. And this is going to be a tricky one. When the project ends after year 4, what are you going to do? You're going to reduce it. Good luck with that. Now, but in this case, I'm going to increase the salary. There is an incremental effect because of this project of $20,000 a year. The second is, when you look at the office space you need you're going to utilize an existing office space in your building. But by doing this, you got to move the stuff that's in there to some storage space, which is going to cost you $1,000 to rent. Again, an incremental effect of the project. So you're going to have to pay the general manager $20,000 more a year, and you're going to have. Should those be factored into my net present value? Yeah, they're side costs. Now, I have a question. What discount rate should I use to discount those cash flows, right? Because the 18.12% was the online venture. If I take the same 18.12%, I have some questions about whether I should be using that 18.12%. The present value of those additional expenses I'm going to have because of this project work out to be, about if you think about 34,352. That's just the present value of $21,000, growing at the inflation rate over time. You subtract that out from your net present value, you come up with an NPV of 40,430. The project is still good, but not as good as I thought it was going to be. If I had to pay my general manager $80,000 more a year, the project would have become a negative one. If we're going to talk side costs, we have to talk specifics. Because otherwise, just a fuzzy number, right? It could lower my net present value, but does it lower it enough to make a decision? In fact, if you don't like to treat side costs separately, you can bring them into your cash flows. All I've done here is taken my original cash flows, brought in the extra amount I have to pay the GM, the general manager, to be there, and the $1,000 storage cost into my cash flows, done one discounting. I'll get exactly the same answer. One thing about NPVs is you can actually take pieces and do them separately, and at the end add them up. I don't want to get too specific, but in Celsius Eats, you have the Celsius Eats revenues, cash flows, but you have a side benefit, right? What's the side benefit? You're going to sell more Celsius beverages. You can bring the Celsius beverage numbers into your cash flows, do one net present value, or you can keep them separate. Do the Celsius Eats separately, the Celsius beverages. You're saying, why would I do one over the other? If you're going to use the same discount rate, you're going to get the same answer either way. But if you're going to use different discount rates in the two, this gives you the flexibility of using different discount rates. So when you have side costs, don't talk about them. Bring them into your analysis. See if it changes your decision. What about side benefits? Before I do that, one final side cost, and this is, often when companies take investments, if they have excess capacity on their computer server, on data systems, on storage, they often use some of that excess capacity for a project. And the rationale usually is, it's excess capacity. We're not using it. Therefore, using it now is costless. What's the big deal? What's the big deal of using excess capacity? Well, basically, you use more of your capacity. And if at some point in time you're going to run out of capacity, this is going to happen sooner rather than later if you've used up some of the excess capacity. Think it through, right? Remember, we talked about what will happen if the project is taken, what will happen if the project is not taken. Think it through what that cost will be, because that's got to be brought into your analysis. You can't view excess capacity as free just because you've already paid for it, because there is always a consequence. So when you think about the framework you're going to use, is ask yourself, what will happen to my capacity usage? If I take the project, what will happen if I don't take the project? The answer is going to stare you in the face as to what the cost is of using up excess capacity. So if you want to come up with creative side costs that come from projects, throw them in there, because you want to figure out a way to bring them into the cash flows. Is there a side cost to Disney Plus producing this endless stream of Avengers shows? I'm enjoying the Daredevil episodes I watched so far, because that was one of my favorite shows then. Is there, you think, a side cost to Disney Plus? Notice the Avengers movies have actually had a couple of Avengers movies that haven't made $1 billion. It was like guaranteed every time. It might be this is they're bad movies, but there's also a possibility that you just have too much Avengers stuff out there, right? That you're diluting the basic. To begin with, this is especially true with the Avengers, you have a multiverse universe. Already it's pretty confusing because you don't know who's alive, who's dead, which particular version of the universe you're in. Now you have shows which put you into other versions of the universe. I'm an Avengers fan. I have no idea where I am in time or space. I expect Thanos to show up any day now. I want him to. He's one of my favorite characters. But and I think the cost here is you might get Disney Plus subscribers by doing this. But I do think you're reducing the value of the franchise movies. And if you're Disney, you got to seriously think about that cost. I think they're aware of it now, because I think one of the first things Iger did when he came in, after Chapek had produced like 12 different Avengers spin-offs and 10 different Star Wars spin-offs, he said, there is a cost here that we're feeling as a company. We've got to slow the process down. But if you're looking at one of these shows for Disney Plus, not only do you have to worry about how do I figure out the additional benefits, you got to bring that side cost in. I want to talk about one other aspect of a side cost that's many businesses, I think, have a tough time dealing with. Okay? When you open a Rio Disney theme park, we estimated the revenues by estimating how many people would come into the theme park and what they would pay, right? But I never stopped and asked the question, would they have come to a Disney theme park anyway? So what are you talking about? Well, if you go to, especially to Orlando, a large percentage of the people in front of you in line are from Latin America, because getting from, Sao Paulo or Santiago to Orlando is actually, it's pretty easy. So maybe some of those people who are coming to Orlando, now that you've opened a Rio Disney theme park, they're going to come to Rio instead. You're saying, so what? Is that revenue then truly incremental? In other words, should I be counting all the revenues? But if 20% of the people would have gone to a Disney theme park already, should I be counting only the 80%? It's a hugely consequential decision, right? Because if I make it only 80%, what's going to happen? My revenues are going to be lower. My earnings and cash flows are going to be lower. I'm just going to open fewer theme parks or take fewer investments if I worry about cannibalization. You're saying that's the right thing to do. Is it though? Is there a consequence to counting only the 80% that I have to think through? Why are they coming to Rio rather than going to Orlando? It's more convenient, right? What if Universal opens a theme park? I know, and this is going to be tricky. And instead of taking your kids, or you promise them we're going to go to a Disney theme park, but you land up in Universal Rio and you tell your kids, there's no Mickey here, but there's Harry Potter. It might not be perfect, and this is going to become a factor in whether you consider it. You might end up losing this 20% to a competitor. I don't think it's going to happen with theme parks, in which case I might count only the 80% saying, or the 100% saying where they're going to go. But the more I worry about competitors eating into I'm going to keep the entire amount, saying if I don't do it, somebody else will cannibalize me. Now, every time a Starbucks opened in the neighborhood, now they're closing, but there's a day, every month there'd be a new Starbucks. Within 4 or 6 blocks of the other Starbucks, the question I would always ask myself is, how many people coming to the Starbucks would have gone into the other Starbucks? Starbucks was a company that mastered cannibalizing itself. But they kept opening stores because clearly they were looking at the total revenues per store. And as a consequence, they ended up with too many stores, and then every 5 or 6 years, they shut stores down. But this is something you're going to see in any kind of chain business where you're thinking about, should I open the next restaurant? Should I open the next, whatever, retail store? How much of that revenue comes? The more protected you are from competition, the more you have to factor in the cannibalization, reduce your sales, because you're going to get those sales anyway. The more open you are to competition, competition can come in. You might have to count the numbers because you have no choice. If Starbucks doesn't open that store 5 blocks from now, Costa or Third World Coffee or whoever else will open the store closer to you, and you're too lazy to walk 6 blocks, you'll walk the 2 blocks. Competition is going to be a big factor in whether you consider this cannibalization or not. So if you feel you're completely protecting against cannibalization, count only the 80%. The 20% that you would have, you're going to get anyway, right? But if you're in a business where there's lots of competition, then act like you get 100%, even though some of it is your own customers because you're your competition. Any questions on cannibalization? Yes, Kelly. Disney knows a lot more about you than you realize, right? I mean, in a sense, you come in, there's a lot of information you gave Disney when you bought your ticket. They know who their repeat customers are and where they're coming from. At least they might not know you by name, but they know in terms of composition where the tourists are coming from. So it is a guess, but my guess is that Disney knows pretty much how much of their Orlando theme park attendance is coming from different parts of the world. Okay. Finally, let's talk about synergy. The definition of synergy is 2 entities coming together are able to create additional cash flows. And with Disney, you can see synergy show up in every conceivable way, right? They have those five, how many theaters do they have in New York? 4 or 5, whatever it is, constantly running Beauty and the Beast, 17 years, 20 years, Lion King for 25 years. I'm not sure those theaters by themselves make money for Disney. But with Disney, it's not just about how much money you make on the investment, it's the ripple effects of what they do in merchandise and theme parks. Okay? In fact, one of Disney's biggest concerns is you've been to a Disney theme park recently, the attendance is becoming a little too adult, too many grown-ups. Why? Because it's too expensive, right? You pay $160 to go into a theme park with a 6-year-old. You know exactly what's going to happen. Midday, your 6-year-old is going to crash and burn. You got to leave the theme park for 5 hours to get them to take a nap. And while they're napping, say, oh my God, that was $15 per hour of the nap. So what do? You drag the kid through from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. saying, you're going to enjoy this come hell or high water. And the problem with the attendance getting too adult is the reason Disney's brand name is where it is because kids came in when they were 4 or 5. I mean, I go with my grandkids, I look at the theme park through their eyes. Okay? They're going to be Disney fans for life, but they're lucky because their father works for Disney, the tickets are free, they go like 25 times a year, right? But if kids are not coming to the theme park, there's a ripple effect you're going to feel, maybe not now, but 30, 40, 50 years from now. Disney, I hope, is thinking seriously about this problem because there are fixes, right? Maybe you'll have 2-tier prices. Maybe if you're 22 years old and you try to come and buy a ticket and it's just you, we turn you away. Saying, no, we don't belong in the theme park. What are you going to do? No. I know it means turning away people affecting, but it's, I think, an issue and it's a synergy effect that you're thinking about further down. So the way this shows out is if there are side benefits, when you do the NPV and you've not captured the side benefits, you're understating the value of this investment. So the question is, first, should I bring these side benefits in? And two, if I decide to bring the side benefits in, how do I capture them? So let's go back to the Harman Audio example, because clearly there were side benefits. That's why Tata Motors was thinking of buying Harman Audio. Oh, first, let me look at the Bookscape example, then we'll come back to the Harman Audio. Let's assume that Bookscape is thinking of adding a cafe. Why? Because, people drink coffee, maybe they'll hang around and buy more books. That was the original idea behind Borders adding. Let's say you're going to add a cafe, and I work through the cash flows. So there's my initial increased revenues, I have my initial investment. But basically, the bottom line is the net present value of this cafe standing alone is negative. So you're saying, I'm not going to open the cafe. And then I say, you know what? If you open the cafe, we will sell more books. It's the onus should be on me to show that. But maybe I run a test market to see how many people kind of buy books and basically, and let's say that I could tell you how much your book sales will increase and the profits and cash flows you will get from that are. You might open the cafe even though standing alone, it's a negative net present value investment because the side benefits tip you over. Of course, if that's the case, then I'm going to ask you, is there another way I can deliver those side benefits? Because in many ways, the cafe becomes that initial investment that allows you to get those side benefits. So side benefits should be factored in. Sometimes, as in this case, they're easy to do. Sometimes they're messier to bring in. But it's not fair after an analysis to tell me their side benefits, not tell me what they are, and ask me to override my number crunching. So now let's go back to the Tata Motors. If you remember, when I valued Harman Audio as a standalone company, the value I arrived at was about 2.476 for the operating asset and 2.7 million for the equity in the firm. The stock was actually trading at 5.2 million. So if you just look at those numbers, it's a bad investment, right? So we're at the Tata Motors meeting, I bring up the numbers that we shouldn't do this acquisition. And then you say, but there could be potential synergies. The reason we're doing this is because we think by buying Harman Audio, we can improve the audio experience in our cars and sell more cars. Of course, the onus is on me to convince you to do that. So let's assume that by doing this, you will be able to sell more cars. But let's be realistic. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take you 3 years to bring Harman Audio into your cars. And after that, you're going to generate 10 billion in after-tax operating income as additional after-tax operating because you sell more cars, primarily in India. Jaguar Land Rovers are already, but this is primarily for Indian sales, and it's going to matter when you think about the discount rate I'm going to apply. And it's going to grow at 4% a year in perpetuity. Yeah. Rupees, yeah. Yeah. So basically 10 billion rupees in additional, after-tax operating. So the question is the present value of that additional income you're going to make from selling your cars greater than that negative net present value you get from paying $2.8 million more than the market price? Let's work it out. First, in terms of risk, the business here is still the automobile business, right? You've now taken, so the beta that I'm going to use is the beta for car companies, not the beta for audio companies. The geographic risk comes from where I think I can get those additional sales. And as I said, I think these sales are primarily going to be in India. So I'm going to use the equity risk premium for India. And in terms of debt ratio, I'm going to stick with the existing debt to cap ratio. So the cost of capital that I'm using to compute these synergies is very different than the cost of capital I used to value. Remember, when I valued Harman Audio, I did everything in dollars. I used the equity risk premium for the company. Here, I'm focused on where the synergies get delivered. So if you look at the cost of capital, I'm going to use in rupee terms because I want to work in rupees. It reflects a beta for automobile companies, the debt ratio for Harman Audio, and the equity risk premium for India as a country. So much higher cost of capital. Use that 13.63%, the value that I get, assuming the 10,000 in after-tax operating income essentially stretches into perpetuity, is about 70.7 billion. I'm still way below where I need to be, but I've brought synergy in. So when you said there are synergies, I'm going to value the synergy and say, even with the synergy brought in, which is about 1.18 billion, I'm still well below the market cap. So what's my advice to you? Even with the synergies, this deal doesn't make sense. In my valuation class, I spend a session talking about synergy, talking about the value of synergy. You can value synergy, but the reason so many acquisitions go off the rocks is rather than valuing synergy and paying for it, it becomes a plug variable. What's a plug variable? You go and buy Harman Audio anyway. You talk about synergy, you never put a number on it, and you say, I paid the extra price because of synergy. That's not fair. If you're going to talk about synergy, you have to bring those considerations into your cash flows. I mean, you have the ammunition now to push back against buzzwords and BS and stuff we use after the fact to kind of justify decisions we want to take anyway. I know you're going to be the skunk at the party because everybody wants the deal to go through. But somebody's got to talk about the numbers. You're going to pay this extra amount. Where is it coming from? What is it worth? Okay. So synergies, side costs, all of those are part of that spectrum of things you want to talk about. But bring them into your numbers because without bringing them into the numbers, it's very easy to fall into that buzzword phenomenon. You're going to see this with AI. I guarantee you. Somebody's going to come up with a project and then your net present value is going to be negative. But somebody's going to say, but this will let us get into AI. Okay. How? Where? In what form? It's healthy to actually start to demand tangible answers to those questions. Because without them, you're going to take the project anyway and then be disappointed 5-10 years later because you're not seeing the cash flow show up. Any questions on synergies, side costs? So be creative. Think about all the things that kind of ripple around when you take a project and try to bring them as best as you can into your analysis. You're going to be wrong in your estimates, but as long as you're not biased, you're going to be okay. And next session, we talk about looking at past projects. This is exactly what I'm going to do. When I look at your past NPVs on projects, I can almost guarantee you that the actual NPVs on these projects would not have matched your past NPVs. Some you're going to come in above, some you're going to come in below. But if in every one of them, your original NPV when you took the project is higher than the actual NPV you got on the project, what's that telling me? There's bias in this process, and I've got to dig through to see why it's happening. So I'm going to leave you with that. Next Wednesday, we're going to start with the Celsius Eats case. So bring your numbers with you. No, but turn in your case before. You can bring in the numbers and compare. You can compare it as I go through my numbers. But don't freak out if our numbers are different, because on some variables at least I gave you room to be different. Okay. Yes. See you, Patrick. Mhm. Right. Davos in Davos, right? Take a look at the people who go to Davos. It's amazing how I am not a conspiracist, but I can see why people feel that the world is being run by hidden powers and when you do that, the power of democracy fades, right? You're saying, why do I waste my time? And especially among young people, it really is, it really is troublesome that we're eating away at the core of the faith in we control our own future. If we vote for the right thing, we talk the unfair. So it doesn't make a difference. My school loans are still going up. I'm still having, and I think I want you to kind of step back. And I did because I feel unsettled, like most people, because it looks like the world I grew up in, and I'm old, is changing under me, right? Because we were moving to this world. I remember the Cold War ending and Fukuyama saying this is, we're going to have this glorious age of freedom and democracy. That was in the 1990s. And you look back and say, what happened?
Yes. Very much like other manufacturing
and I found it very insulting when people in New York would tell these people out there in the hinterland, learn to code. I mean, how do you take a 55-year-old man worker worked in a factory and tell him go do something else to begin with, you're already discounting what the value of his life has been. You're just I can replace you with a worker in India. That's a very insulting message. So I think it's easy to look at this and talk about Trump and tariffs, but I think we've been building up to this moment for a long time. And Trump and tariffs are not going to be the end of it. You're going to see people in Europe getting elected who are going to do their version of this. And it's all it can get.
I know it's kind of like this change in regulatory, like now regulatory, they like fire workers, like controllers, like programs and all that. It's more complicated.
You know what? I look at a classroom like this and I work because there are people in this room who used to be doctors, engineers, scientists. And for 40 years, finance has been sucking up the best and the brightest out of other professions, bringing them in here, turning them into traders and bankers. And that's not good. Yeah, but there are a lot of people who are science backgrounds and engineers that we've sucked in. And I'm not blaming them. They're making the right choice for them because engineering doesn't pay as much as being a trader, and I can understand the transition. But as a society, this is not good to take your best and brightest and put them in front of terminals in places like New York City when they can be, there's a kid who was admitted to MIT because he developed this new way of treating Alzheimer's. He's at 17. And I looked at where he was now, and he's working at D.E. Shaw as in their hedge fund. And I said, that's an opportunity lost for society that we took somebody who could have made a difference as a doctor or as a researcher. But I think I would trace all of that back to globalization as well, because it shifted the power of the financial markets. No, I think there are so many things that boil up to the surface. And it feels like we've been leading up to this moment for a long time. And of course, a Doge Mustang is a disruption that is company-wide that somehow now is being tried out in countries. And I can understand the motive, which is government's not government.
But at the same time, I know people who are on Medicare and Social Security, and they live check to check, right? You break that system and you don't fix it quickly, people are dying, right? So this is not disrupting Twitter and laying off people. This is so it's, it's I can see events unfolding, but I worry about whether we've thought through the consequences because there's this habit of kind of jumping in as a society, as and let it kind of roll around your mind because I don't have any answer to this. I don't know how this will end. I mean, we know how the French Revolution ended, right? There is that end game of people's heads being cut off. We have the Bolshevik Revolution. So there are times when this ends violently, and I hope that's not the end game. But I think we need to do something. We need to do something as a society, not just in America, but across the world, to take care of. I mean, because I hate it when people say this is a win. Everything is a trade-off. Tell me who's losing when you're winning. So when Uber is presenting, well, look at how great this is. Well, there are losers in this. There's cab drivers in New York City who now don't have a job. There's a whole ecosystem that's being disrupted. I understand the net effect is positive, but we let the losers kind of slip away and we don't take care of them. There is this residue we're creating that could be incredibly costly for us in the long term. Thank you for reading. No? Yeah, you're welcome. Take care. Hey, how are you?
There's some so this we just in order to get unlevered beta, we use this for it. Can we use this for the lever beta as well?
Levered beta, you gotta wait by equity. It's a consistency. Unlevered beta go with the whole business. Levered beta are just based on equity. The problem with taking weighted average of levered beta is you're assuming that the leverage after the combination could be similar than before. But acquisitions are funded with debt ratios can be very different from the existing factors. That's why you always go back to the unlevered beta first. And then you bring in the effect of leverage separate. Technically, mechanically, I could take the weighted average of any number, right? So if you wanted an equity beta, I could take the equity value much. So if you have a portfolio and you ask me what the beta of your portfolio is, I think levered beta for each investment in your portfolio, I multiply by the equity you've invested in each business, I take away that. But that's because you're a portfolio manager, right? You're stuck with whatever the debt ratio is. But we doing a merchant, you have to start with the unlevered beta.
Yeah. But you want to find, like, let's say, because
What are you trying to do a weighted average? Tell me what the context is when I talk about that.
no, I just want it's actually just I'm just wondering. I'm not doing the calculation of anything, but I just wonder, like, because you mentioned earlier that
In what context? Are you wondering in what context? As a company, as an investor?
as a company,
As a company,
Yeah.
you definitely have to go down levered beta. Because debt is a choice. Equity locks you into that choice.
yeah, actually, I mean, like, so for example, if I got a better of if my firm have
So
five
let's say
division,
this is first it's division. There's no such thing as an
business,
equity beta.
sorry, yeah,
No,
business.
no, but 5 businesses. Remember, you always have to go down levered beta because businesses don't carry their own debt.
They don't.
Not that you can see it from the outside. That is basically money that the money company collects. It might end up in individual
Okay.
projects, and even within the company, it's like Disney, where is your debt location? How do you trace it out?
Okay,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
So you can't trace. So basically, you got to start with unlevered just like this. Then you can allocate the debt of the company across the businesses based on who's got the most physical assets. But you always start with the unlevered. You eventually end up with a levered beta because you're using your cost of capital. But you start with the unlevered beta to get to the beta.
And for the second question, so in this example, we use the cost of debt of the company to discount as a discount rate to like find market value of the debt, right? So I just wonder how is that like why we do that? I thought we should use the market rate as a discount rate in order to get the
What
market
does
value.
it mean, market rate? The market rate is the rate at which you can borrow money long term. That's a cost of debt for the company. That's our definition of cost of debt.
No, but for example, right, the company, my company, let's say the rate on the rating is constant, but
What do you mean? How is it constant? Rates are changing, default spreads are changing. How will it be constant?
well, in order to get the cost of debt of the company, reduce the risk-free plus the default.
At a
right,
point
right.
in time, it should be different tomorrow and the day after.
Yeah. But okay. But the
Why
default spread,
if you're adding the interest risk-free rate to the default spread, won't the risk-free rate be different tomorrow? And the default spread will be different as well. So why do you act like it's a number that's going to be a plus?
yeah, I just realized that that's where I forgot about risk rate. My bad. Okay.
And even the default spread will change. Even if the rating doesn't change, default spread change. So both the risk-free rate and default spreads are moving numbers.
Yeah.
So your cost of debt will be a moving number, and your cost of debt is a moving number. Your market value of debt is default.
Got it. And when we call debt, we can assume that it's interest-bearing debt, right? When
Any
it is
contractual
cost.
commitment.
And the contractual.
Leases are counted as debt.
Yeah.
You sign a baseball player for 10 years and that's counted as debt. Netflix agrees to carry a show for the next 5 years and pays that debt. Any contractual commitments and interest bearing.
Got it. But I just wonder because when I search it up in the capital IQ, their debt to equity ratio, they just use the book value or stuff. So we cannot use the.
You cannot use ratio. Why would you want to use ratio? You can compute debt and equity and do the ratio yourself. Why do you depend on other people to give you the ratio?
I mean, if they do correctly, I don't need to do.
You can't assume that, right? So do the debt, whenever you have a ratio, compute it yourself.
Got it. One last question. Can I just. So in order to get like the company, can I just go and look at it like average 5 years of the interest expense?
You just told me where you get cost of debt, risk-free rates are default rate. So you can't go take the average.
But why is that included?
Because the numbers will be different. The average of the last 5 years is the T1 rate, 3%, the T1 rate was 4.7%. Now, the cost of debt based on an average. Would it be, let's say you came to a doctor and said, you're taking your blood pressure today, I'm going to take the average blood pressure you had over the last 5 years. Would that get you into trouble?
I see that. But if like last 5 years, the interest rate doesn't change and we expect that in the next 5 years, it doesn't change.
Today said, this happens to be equal to the average. So you're always going to be right using today's rate. Why do this averaging over time and this only get all like there's no upside.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Professor, how are you? We had a question about our case. So for in the write-up, we were just kind of like the actual kind of writing of it with the investment decision, not much.
The data I gave you the data, right? That's relatively few. So the write-up was basically about the assumption.
Now,
For instance, I said, do along with that. Would I specify it along with that? That's the appropriate choice? Right?
See what I'm saying? Hey.
When we do 20 additional.
How old is this? Getting this in
That's a choice, right? So you need to put on choice. So whatever. Then you do it. Then you gotta make assumptions about it. So anything that you're adding is choice. This example, say there's a cost and you come up with a way that's tell me how much there is enough data availability here about how people do it. Anything that you did, so don't repeat the revenue cost. That's already in there. After you've got it, you gotta tell me what you do. And it's not a slam dunk. If you positive, you might take all of the decision making. You might decide not to take a project when you go to positive. Or you might decide to take the project and go to negative. And if so, I will have to. Wow. Section is a little more difficult. But I think that the decision part is where you will take. Otherwise, it's huge. Make a decision, but I'm assuming to bring some products to this.
And are qualitative factors at all in play here or not?
Your qualitative factors, I talk about leverage.
Got it. And you're not looking for anything that long, right? You create like no more than a couple pages.
One thing is I want to see that data and put them on show.
most of the assumptions, like in the model, we have cash flow, but it does have built-in assumptions at the bottom.
Most of the assumptions are coming from the base, right? So,
Yeah, well, not like critical ones like that, but calculations that you might not see with the cash flow. That are referencing other cells.
That's what they've figured out, right? So most of the numbers, you have to get sure that like in fact, there's something explicit that's going to be done, like highlighted. Along with everything else, I can look at the cash flow table and see if it's first time, but the number. All right. Thanks
Thank
so much.
you.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Yeah.
Yes, but very, I've done lots of in finance. Honestly, you clearly don't teach that. Yes. Really kind of something
What are you doing, Singapore again? She mentioned it.
I was,
I see it in sessions that are. I do Singapore actually, the Latin America, the Caribbean. I can think all the time. I think I did it today, but I'm thinking for like. It's an open seminar, so they.
Okay, so next time, okay, perfect.
I come to Singapore probably once every year or two.
For the seminars,
I
was
do
it?
it 2 day evaluation.
Okay, is it in tie up with the university or is it just?
No, no, it's just the open seminar, so you can maintain what they
I'll be
mentioned.
there. That's fine. I just meet you, just want to say hi. Is it okay if I get a quick picture?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
Good luck to you.